Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
I don't think he would be president if he weren't the authentic man he is. But it also has its costs. There are times when, a bit less transparency would be helpful to those of us who are operatives working on his behalf.
Hello and welcome to Chopper's Politics, the Telegraph's weekly political podcast. Your usual host, Christopher Hope, is still off in the wild somewhere for his holiday, which leaves me to guide you through another big week in American politics. I'm Ben Riley-Smith, the Telegraph's US editor and host of our podcast, Crossfire. Last week was all about the Democratic convention, Joe Biden's nomination, Barack Obama's attacks, and Kamala Harris making history. This week, it's the turn of the Republicans. We know a bit about what Donald Trump has in store. There'll be a speech from the White House. Fireworks are planned. And, thanks to the coronavirus pandemic, there won't be big crowds. It is another huge moment in the campaign. Trump is running out of time to overcome his deficit in the polls. This week, much of the nation is watching. Votes are up for grabs. Coming up, you'll hear from the Mooch, Anthony Scaramucci, about why he's now campaigning to defeat his former boss. And to get a sense of what's happening on the ground, one Trump voter will explain why he's abandoned the president. But first, I talked to Steve Cortes. Steve's a senior advisor to the Trump 2020 campaign, and as such, knows what's really happening on the inside. We began by discussing what to expect from this week. And please do excuse the noises coming from Steve's computer. Think of it as an added insight into the world of stay-at-home political consultancy.
As with the same with the Democrats, it will be an unconventional convention, to be sure. But so many things are unusual about the world in 2020, including politics. There are, of course, advantages and disadvantages to this online or television-only format rather than large in-person events regarding the conventions. But we will certainly be highlighting a lot of regular Americans and their stories. Some people that you might have heard of only a bit or have never heard of at all. But for example, we're going to highlight people who have unfortunately been the victims of cancel culture. Which is a really regrettable trend in American society right now, where the elites of a lot of important circles of life, whether it's workplaces, academia, media, those elites are trying to effectively silence people who have alternative points of view, people who happen to support the America First movement or President Trump. So we're going to showcase and celebrate some of the regular Americans who are brave enough to voice their First Amendment rights and make their political preferences known. You're obviously also going to hear from a lot of our leadership that are very well known, and culminating, of course, then with the president accepting the Republican nomination at the White House on Thursday.
Now, the choice of the White House is interesting as a location because some of the Democrats have been critical because it is a governmental building and this is a party political moment. I mean, do you think it's okay for the president to use the White House as the backdrop, given it is kind of the emblem of governmental power?
Sure. No, listen, I actually think it's more than okay. And none of us believe, including the president, that it is his personal home. I mean, we know that. It is the people's house. But for the time being, it is his home. And I firmly hope it's going to be his home for 4 more years. So in this unusual environment where so many people have to work from home and where we can't stage the kinds of very large scale events that we would like to be staging, those of us here in the Trump campaign, for example, would do anything if we could stage rallies again, large scale rallies. But given all of those realities of this COVID world right now, to me, it's only fitting and right that the president of the United States would accept his nomination from the White House. It's not without precedent. It has been done before, and it will be done in a way, that is safe and also a way that celebrates America. And again, for now, at least, it is actually, in actuality, his home. And in a work from home era, the president's going to work from home on Thursday night. He will just happen to be doing it in front of a national audience.
Now, we all know opinion polls can be flawed. They're snapshots of moments in time. They can miss out some voters. But there is a consistent picture right now, which is Joe Biden ahead in the national polls and ahead in quite a few of the battleground states. Where do you see the race now, less than 3 months out? Do you think Trump is behind? And if so, what does he need to do to overcome that gap?
Look, I'd be the first to concede. I think in terms of national polls, I think we're slightly down. If you look at polling averages, those polls have also tightened up pretty dramatically in the last few weeks. And I don't pay too much attention to any individual poll. I prefer to look at averages of polls. But of course, the election's not a national race. It's an election of states. It's effectively 50 different elections. And if we look at the battleground states, we see that we are either effectively tied, meaning within the margin of error, or in some cases actually leading in battleground states. But look, I'm not Pollyanna. I don't want to pretend that everything is fine. I believe that this is going to be a brawl. I really believe that. I think it's going to be a cage match in these battleground states. And I want to assume that we're down, even if we're not. I think it's the right posture for us to take as a campaign and as a candidate for the president himself. I think we need to work and hustle and assume that this is going to be a grind. The American people, I would also say a couple of things regarding polls. Number one is most people who aren't intensely political, let's face it, haven't been paying a whole lot of attention to politics. And that's traditionally the case, and that's totally fine. Once we get past the conventions, once we get past Labor Day in the U.S., that's when a lot of Americans tend to recognize it as a sort of political season and pay more attention in September and October into the election. So I wouldn't put too much credence in any poll right now necessarily, even ones that are favorable to us. But secondly, and I think this is a reality, it's hard to quantify, but I mentioned earlier the unfortunate cancel culture that's taken root in a lot of American society. And I think a lot of people who support the president are understandably reluctant to voice that support, particularly to a stranger who is trying to take a poll. So I think there is a bit of, I know in the UK it's known as the shy Tory effect. I think there's a bit of a shy Trump effect in the polls. I don't want to assume that. I don't want to rely upon that. But I do believe that it is very likely the reality.
Can we talk about coronavirus briefly? A huge topic which has clearly utterly changed the political landscape in America for the election, as well as just the reality of what's happening on the ground. Again, you don't want to put too much weighting on polls, but it does suggest that more Americans are disapproving of how the president has handled the pandemic than approving. Are there things you think he needs to do in this week of the convention and in the next 2.5 months to reassure America that he is taking this seriously and is on top of the crisis as a whole?
Well, I think, unfortunately, we're fighting against a really pernicious and dishonest media narrative that Donald Trump has somehow mishandled our response to the virus, and a just total lie that the U.S. is somehow uniquely suffering from the virus. Neither of those is true. And let me take them one by one. First, regarding the president's response, look, the United States at the federal level, the primary role of the federal government in terms of response is to be a backup system for the states. And what I mean by that is to get the equipment to the states that they need, and also to provide the capacity that they would need if local health systems became overwhelmed. Now, thankfully, that never happened. However, the federal government stepped up in massive ways, sending massive military hospital ships and enormous capacity to places like New York City, with field hospitals in Central Park, at the massive Javits Convention Center in Manhattan. So capacity was never an issue in terms of equipment or availability of ICU beds, availability of healthcare professionals. So the federal government did its job in that regard extremely well. Unfortunately, a lot of local leaders did a disastrous job. People like Governor Cuomo, who the Democrats had the temerity to showcase as some sort of example of handling the coronavirus. The reality is, if New York State were its own country, it would be, in terms of death rate, the second worst country on earth, the only country, as it were, being worse, New Jersey, next door, run by a very similar liberal Democratic governor. So what we've seen in most of America, outside of New York and New Jersey, is a very effective response to the virus. And then to that second point I mentioned, the U.S. press wants us to believe that we are in a singularly or uniquely bad situation regarding the virus, and that's just not true. This is a global virus. It's not President Trump's fault. It's not the Democrats' fault. It's the fault of the Chinese Communist Party. They knowingly deceived the world. They knowingly infected the world. They protected the rest of China from Wuhan. They sealed off Shanghai and Beijing, but they exposed the rest of the world, allowing plentiful travel from Wuhan all over Europe to the United States to San Francisco. So the only people at fault are the CCP. And I think ultimately the American people are going to recognize that. But getting back to our performance relative to the world, if we look at U.S. versus the developed world, again, on a per capita basis, which is the only honest way to look at it, we see that we're doing much, much better than the UK, Belgium, Sweden, Spain, Italy. We're doing about the same as France. So the idea that there is some unique American disaster, and again, I'm not diminishing, there's actually absolutely very real suffering. And it's terrible. A lot of people have endured significant loss. They've lost people extremely dear to them. But from a policy perspective, if we step back and look at the policy approach, the United States, again, is not doing poorly at all compared to our peer nations in the world. And as a matter of fact, we're doing quite a lot better than many of them, particularly in Europe.
One more question, because I know you're short for time. I think one thing that people in America on both sides of the political spectrum can agree is that Donald Trump speaks his mind, and it's fascinating covering previous elections and covering this election.
Sure.
Elections I've covered in the past, politicians have a veneer and they have a line and they don't go beyond that line and they try and have message discipline. Donald Trump says whatever he likes in every format, in his tweets, in his responses to reporters, in his big rally speeches when they were happening. How hard can that be for a campaign which traditionally tends to want to pick a couple of topics and have as much control as possible?
Sure. Look, I'll just be very honest. I think it's one of his biggest attributes, but it can also be some of his biggest hurdles, right? His authenticity and his transparency. I don't think he would be president if he weren't the authentic man he is. It really resonated with the American people in 2016 that he was not a scripted and lawyerly candidate, that he was sort of the anti-politician running for political office. But it also has its costs. Yeah, I'll be the first to admit that. And there are times when, a bit less transparency would be helpful to those of us who are operatives working on his behalf. But on the whole, I think the level of communication with the American people has been incredible for him, and I hope for the people. No politician ever has communicated as openly and as constantly with the people as President Trump has, whether it's directly using social media or via the press. He makes himself available on a near constant basis to the media, and to a media which frankly is very antagonistic and I would argue even disrespectful to him. Nonetheless, he submits himself to their scrutiny. It's the exact opposite of what we see with Joe Biden, somebody who rarely submits to scrutiny, who pretty much only participates in highly scripted, tightly choreographed events from his basement. And I think in the end, while there are some problems with Trump's constant communication, in the end, I believe that the contrast of an able, engaged, communicating leader, Donald Trump, versus a largely hiding Joe Biden dwelling in his basement, I believe that contrast is going to compel voters to our side.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thanks for taking the time. It's really appreciated.
Of course. And I'm sorry about recording issues. I'm going to press stop now on this.
Yes, me too.
Okay, don't go anywhere. Next up, Anthony Scaramucci pulls no punches on the man who used to be his boss. After this.
Sick of gotcha political coverage?
Tired of the endlessly cynical news cycle?
Secretly think that most journalists are on another planet?
Do we have the show for you? Join us on Planet Normal, a Telegraph podcast that speaks your language.
Bringing you news and views from beyond the bubble, with columnists Alison Pearson.
That's me, and Liam Halligan.
That's me.
I finally learnt what a podcast is, and even how you can subscribe to one. It's actually very simple. Search Planet Normal on your podcast app, or click on the link in the show notes from this episode.
You could say one small step for me and Alison, but one giant leap for normal people everywhere. Bit much?
Yeah, when aren't you too much?
Do you remember the Mooch? Despite lasting just 11 days as Mr. Trump's White House communications director, he's become one of the most well-known faces from the Trump administration. He's also one of the most critical. Having left office in July 2017 and become disillusioned, Scaramucci is now openly trying to stop the president getting a second term on November 3rd. I began by asking him if Donald Trump was winning or losing the election right now.
I think it's very hard to know. If you force me to make a prediction, I think he's going to lose because he's got too many things going against him now to overcome the differential between him and Vice President Biden.
Can you unpack that a bit? What is going against him so badly right now?
Well, he's got three major things, all of which historically have never worked well for an incumbent president. He's got an annihilation of the economy. We're in a full-blown recession. 40 million people are now looking for work. There's been no incumbent president since 1920 that has won re-election in a scenario like that. The second thing he's got going against him is he has totally mishandled the COVID-19 crisis. 67% of the American population thinks that he's completely mishandled the situation. And then the last thing he's got going against him is the gender gap. He has the widest gender gap of any incumbent president in American history. He's got a 28% gender gap with women over the age of 50. He still has 52% of the white men in the population, but it's just not enough. If you look at the board, I mean, he has his Republican cohorts believing that he's Ronald Reagan from 1984 and that he won the last election by a landslide. But he's always been an unpopular president, meaning he's never won the popular vote, and he's not set up to win the popular vote right now. Even his ardent supporters recognize that he can't win the popular vote. The only way he can win this is through the Electoral College, and he's alienated and upset so many different people over the last 3.5 years, myself included, that there's a very beautiful, colorful mosaic of Americans that are rallying together to vote him out. And so those are the things that he's got going against him.
You mentioned your own story. Most people back in Britain will remember your close to 2 weeks in the White House as his top spinner. Talk through your journey from that position a little over 2 years ago to now where you are now, which is pretty critical and fierce opponent of his.
I was actually trying to be supportive of him. You know, I remember I worked on the campaign. I was only in the White House for 11 days, but I worked on the campaign. I worked on the transition committee. When I joined the White House in July of 2017, it was really to help him remove Priebus and Bannon. Obviously, I made a mistake in the White House. I got myself fired. I never blamed anybody for it. When I left the White House, it was important for me to maintain loyalty to the party and loyalty to President Trump. And so I did that. But I tell people loyalty is symmetrical. You can't have asymmetric loyalty. That means the other side's disloyal. So, you know, when you're separating women from children and you're putting them in cages, you can't do that. You make your supporters look bad. When you are telling everybody that the press is the enemy of the people, you and I don't know each other, but I would suspect you're probably not on the MI5 or MI6 list as an enemy of the British people. So in a free society and in the United States where the First Amendment is first for a reason, you've got the American president saying that the press is the enemy of the people. I mean, come on, it's ridiculous. So it was a series of different things that he's doing over the 24 months. And then finally, he's going after the squad. He's saying that these women should go back to the country that they originally came from. That's a racist, nativist trope. Can't talk like that. I'm an Italian American. My grandmother was told in the 1920s when she arrived here to go back to the country that she originally came from. She had 2 sons of my mom. 2 of those sons went on to World War II and fought for the country. Should she have gone back to the country that she originally came from? I mean, it's a bunch of absolute nonsense. And so now I have been an outspoken critic. September, October, boom, he gets impeached. You had at least Mitt Romney say that he was obviously a criminal, so he voted to convict him. And they all felt like willing accomplices, willing acolytes of his. And so they opted for the cover-up mode as opposed to cleanup. But you can't cover up somebody as crazy as Donald Trump. And so one of the cabinet members in October of 2019 came to my office in New York, and we were allowed to go to our offices back in the day. And he turned to me and said, this is going to be a very, very bad situation because he can't manage anything. And if we get a crisis, God forbid, he's immobilized the entire executive branch of the United States. And so in a crisis, we will not respond well to the crisis. And then a month or 2 later, he's mishandling the COVID-19 crisis and he's paralyzing our society and he's destroying our economy. So that's where we are. I mean, you have to be objective about these things. I don't like demonizing Mr. Trump. I can tell you what's good about him. I can tell you what's bad about him. But you have to be objective. Imagine if the 2 of us were on a public company board and Mr. Trump was our CEO of our publicly traded company and he acted the way he acts, we would have to seek his removal.
As you said, coronavirus has totally upended the election. 2016, 8 years of Obama, it was a change election after a decade of stagnant growth. Coronavirus has made this election about leadership in a crisis. And what would happen in the remaining 2 and a bit months if the number of COVID cases dropped dramatically? Let's say it's a quarter or an eighth of where it was at the summer height. Trump declares a coronavirus vaccine has been found, as he's been hinting at recently. And if you begin to get these huge jumps in job numbers, obviously it dropped down very quickly, but there is evidence that it could jump up very quickly in terms of millions of new jobs being created. Do you think that would give him a chance of getting over the line?
I would never count Mr. Trump out. If this is a prize fight and these are two heavyweights that are fighting each other, Mr. Trump has to be knocked through the ropes, and he's got to be put into the first or second row where the VIPs sit at these prize fights. And so we'll have to see if we can do that or not. I think the good news is he has polarized so many people. He has victimized so many people. He has ostracized so many people that there's a very willing coalition. You've got a great irony about Mr. Trump. He has united the country. He just happens to be uniting the country against himself. And so you've got Republicans like myself and radical leftists that are teaming up to defeat him. And so it's an interesting mosaic, and we'll have to see if that mosaic can pull it off. I don't know. If you tell me that those facts are going to happen, listen, I was at an event in Abu Dhabi in February. Speaker Paul Ryan was speaking there. How many people think Mr. Trump is going to win re-election? I would say universally the elites in that room raised their hands and said he is going to win. I raised my hand and say he's going to lose. And people say, well, you're nuts. Why would you think he's going to lose? I would say because the consensus is so overshot and so baked in that he's going to win. You're not calculating that something could happen, a deus ex machina event could happen to derail him. And so that has happened, and he's been derailed. And now what you're suggesting, in the next 81 days, there could be a reversal of some of that news, and there could be a deus ex machina event that is in his favor, and I'm willing to accept that. I would say, yes, there's a possibility that that could happen, and a result of which you don't know, and that's why you have to remain diligent here and try to punch this SOB right through the ropes.
It is interesting how there's this cohort of people who worked very closely with Trump in the White House and are now openly critical. I mean, as well as yourself, John Bolton's done his damning book. Jim Mattis, the former defense secretary, was scathing about the president recently. John Kelly, the former chief of staff, has been critical at times. Do you think swing voters buy what you guys are saying, or by Trump's argument that, listen, this is just all sour grapes from people who got forced out?
I'm certain that there will be a percentage of the population that will say the collection of us are just disgruntled, disenfranchised employees, and therefore we're spinning a false narrative. Or you could step back from it objectively and say, okay, hey, there's got to be something wrong with this guy. I mean, everybody that's worked for him dislikes him. Everybody. And so you got guys like Michael Cohen writing books about him. You've got guys like General Mattis, a totally different person than Michael Cohen, saying that what he's done on policy and what he's done in terms of using our military against our own peaceful civilians when they're in peaceful protest is a non-starter. I don't know. Yes, of course, there'll be a group of people, no matter what he does, they'll be in support of him. But I'm willing to bet that rational, normal people, independents and moderates will look at what's going on and say, okay, we have to stop that. We have to end that. And so that we can figure out a way to reknit our society.
Can you give us a distillation of the drive that you're doing to... Am I right in saying it's targeting Republican voters specifically to try and peel them away from Trump?
Yeah, I would say independents, moderates, Republican voters. You know, I'm an Italian American that grew up in a blue collar community. And so I've identified those similar communities in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. And I'll be traveling to those areas. I'll be speaking on talk radio. I will go on opposition networks. I have no problem with that. And if I can move 2, 3, 5, 1% of the people, it's over. He's going to lose the popular vote for sure. The question is, there's 6 or 7 swing states. Can he win those swing states to win the election? You know, I'm a fighter. And so I'll be in there fighting every day incrementally, trying to do my part to make that not happen and to have Joe Biden become president. Because I think also that will help the Republican Party. If Trump wins, you're going to send the Republican Party back to the dark ages. That party needs to be opened up. That party needs more color. That party needs more income stratas. That party needs a broader message to stay competitive over the next 25 to 50 years. The Trump message is a Paleolithic message. It's not a modern message.
Lastly, we wanted to try and bring you a sense of what's happening away from the Washington bubble. We don't know what the story of this election will end up being, but one emerging narrative, according to the polls, is the sizable groups of people who voted for Trump in 2016, but now don't support him. Why have they changed their minds? Was there a moment that triggered the switch? My colleague, Rosina Sabur, has been talking to voters about exactly that. One of them, Jay, agreed to share his story, and he dealt with remote podcasting like a pro.
Wow, okay. This is very complicated for a retired guy.
I'm sorry, Jay.
That's okay. I've learned a lot of new stuff already.
Jay, thank you so much for doing this.
You're very welcome.
So, can you talk me through a bit about what you were thinking November 2016? What made you vote for Donald Trump? What were the motivations at the time?
Okay. Well, let me give you a little background first, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I am a 68-year-old registered independent living in the state of North Carolina, which, as you know, is a swing state in most elections. I have voted in 12 presidential elections, and the last time I voted for a Democrat was in 1976 when I voted for Jimmy Carter.
Wow.
So I'm fiscally and socially conservative. I generally vote for most Republicans, and I did vote for Donald Trump in 2016. To me, the 2016 election was a choice between, it was really the lesser of two evils. I was not at all a Hillary Clinton fan. I felt that she had a lot of baggage that she was bringing to the election. I wasn't crazy about voting for Donald Trump. I literally held my nose when I voted for Donald Trump, but I felt that he would bring some business experience. His thoughts on different policies resonated more with me than any of Hillary's thoughts on policies. So at the end of the day, he was the lesser of two evils, but unfortunately I didn't realize just how evil he could be.
Right. So did you think that some of the things that he said and did at the time would stay behind when he entered office and he'd just leave that at the door of the White House?
I think there's a lot of that. I mean, on the one hand, I tried to separate out what he was saying about policy, whether it was tax reductions, whether it was a reduction in regulation, whether it was nominating conservative justices to the Supreme Court and lower courts. And I tried to separate that out from his behavioral issues that certainly were apparent to everyone.
After 4 years, if the Democrats had, nominated someone like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, would you have still supported Trump for another 4 years? Or is it,
No.
That you were done with him entirely and you would have voted for anyone else?
So that's an excellent question. No, over the last 4 years, it's become clear to me I just cannot support Donald Trump no matter what. But I personally could not have voted for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, the two that you mentioned. There are Democrats that I could have voted for, and I will vote for Joe Biden. Kamala Harris did a fantastic job in her speech. I feel very comfortable with her, but I would not have been comfortable voting for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. And in that case, most likely, I would have probably voted for a third-party candidate, which I would rather not do because I'm very enthusiastic about voting Donald Trump out of office.
What do you think about Joe Biden and his policies? Are you enthusiastic about them, or are you just like, he's, again, the better of two evils?
Well, I think I would certainly have differences of opinion with him on some of his policies, and there's probably no question about that. But I think that Joe Biden is a very decent and honorable man, and he will be able to restore honor, decency, and dignity to the White House, which is really the kind of legacy I want to leave for my grandchildren. I want them to respect the office of the presidency and understand that it's okay to have differences about policy. In fact, that's what really has made this country great, is that we do have differences of opinion about policies. But we really need to restore honor, dignity, and decency to the office of the presidency. Am I enthusiastic about voting for Joe Biden? I'm okay voting for Joe Biden, but I'm very enthusiastic about doing what I can to ensure that Donald Trump leaves the White House next January. There are haters out there who will say, well, gosh, what were you thinking in 2016? Well, okay, half the country voted for Donald Trump. But we've got to move on. And I'm saying that it's okay to change your mind and it's okay to vote for the country over party. So, yeah, you can still blame me because I did vote for Trump in 2016. I admit it. But we're moving on. And here's what I want to do in 2020.
So, Jay, how will you feel when you tick that box on the ballot paper on November 3rd? Or if you're doing a postal vote before?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to vote early. You can vote early here in North Carolina, so I'm going to vote early. As to your question as to how I will feel when I tick the box, a little while ago I said that when I voted for Trump in 2016, I literally held my nose. I can guarantee you that when I tick the box in 2020 and vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I will not be holding my nose.
So that's all for this week. Christopher Hope is packing up his tent and will be back next week with all the news from Westminster. Subscribe to this feed to make sure you don't miss it. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please do consider rating the show and maybe even leaving a short review. It really does help other people find Chopper's Politics. Thank you to the guests today, Steve Cortes, Anthony Scaramucci and Jay. And to the show's producers, Theodora Laludis and Louisa Wells. If you're all caught up on Chopper's Politics and twiddling your thumbs, head to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you can get 30 days access to all our journalism completely free. This week, I can particularly recommend Rosina's piece, unpacking what she found when talking to Jay and many other disappointed Trump voters. One more plug. If you're interested in more US political listens, please do check out my podcast, Crossfire, about the Trump-Russia spying scandal and how the UK was involved. If you want to get in touch with the show, maybe there's a guest you'd love to hear, email chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or you can find me on Twitter @BenRileySmith. And lastly, of course, please do keep buying your copy of the Daily Telegraph. Until next time, goodbye.